The passengers of Air France Flight 139 had no reason to expect anything unusual on June 27, 1976. The Airbus A300 had departed from Tel Aviv, Israel, en route to Paris, France, with a scheduled stop in Athens, Greece. On board were 246 passengers and 12 crew members, among them families, business travelers, and vacationers. Many were Israeli citizens, but there were also people from France, the United States, and other countries. As the plane landed in Athens, 58 more passengers boarded. Among them were 4 individuals who no one suspected were about to hijack their plane. They took their seats, calm and composed, blending in with the crowd. Then, just 8 minutes after takeoff from Athens, chaos erupted. A German man and woman, along with 2 Palestinian men, suddenly leaped from their seats. Weapons were drawn. A grenade was brandished. "This plane is now under our control," one of them shouted. Panic swept through the cabin. Frightened passengers clutched their children, others ducked in their seats, praying this was all just a bad dream. At first, the plane was redirected toward Benghazi, Libya, a known supporter of Palestinian militant groups. It landed there briefly, refueled, and then, under orders from the hijackers, took off again. The destination: Uganda. This was no ordinary hijacking. It was a well-planned mission, with powerful allies waiting on the ground. The terrorists had chosen Entebbe Airport, the main international airport of Uganda, because they knew they would be protected there. The man who welcomed them was none other than Idi Amin, Uganda's brutal dictator. Idi Amin had ruled Uganda with an iron fist since 1971, known for his erratic behavior, mass executions, and love for the spotlight. He had once been an ally of Israel, but after a fallout with the Israeli government, he turned against them and aligned himself with Palestinian militants. Now, he saw an opportunity to become a central player on the world stage. With Ugandan troops assisting them, the hijackers forced all hostages off the plane and into an abandoned terminal building at the airport. They made their demands clear. 1. The release of 52 Palestinian and pro-Palestinian prisoners held in Israel and other countries. 2. A $5 million ransom from the French government. 3. A 72-hour deadline, or they would begin executing hostages. Back in Israel, military leaders, intelligence officers, and government officials gathered in Tel Aviv. They had just received the horrifying news, and the weight of the crisis settled upon them like a storm cloud. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin faced a choice that no leader ever wants to make. Should they negotiate with terrorists, risking Israeli lives and emboldening future hijackings? Or should they launch a high-risk military operation, one that could result in hundreds of casualties? Rabin turned to his defense minister, Shimon Peres. "We have no choice," Peres said, his voice firm. "We must bring them home." The greatest hostage rescue mission in history had just begun. As the sun rose over Entebbe, Uganda, the hostages trapped inside the abandoned terminal felt the weight of their situation sinking in. Armed terrorists patrolled the building, their fingers resting on the triggers of their rifles. Outside, Idi Amin's Ugandan soldiers stood guard, ensuring that no one could escape. The world was watching, but no one seemed to have a solution. Back in Israel, the crisis room at military headquarters in Tel Aviv was filled with top commanders, intelligence officers, and government leaders. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Defense Minister Shimon Peres sat at the head of the table, their faces tense. The situation was far worse than they had initially feared. The hijackers had separated the hostages. They had forced all Israeli and Jewish passengers into one group and released the non-Jewish hostages. When these freed passengers arrived in Paris, they revealed what had happened inside the terminal. The terrorists had sorted the hostages based on their religion and nationality, an act that carried chilling echoes of Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust. The Israeli government was outraged. But that wasn't the worst part. Through intelligence sources, they learned that Idi Amin himself was actively supporting the hijackers. The Ugandan dictator, who had once received military training from the Israelis, had turned against them. Instead of stopping the terrorists, he was treating them as his personal guests. Israeli commanders had planned for a hostage rescue mission that would take out just 4 terrorists. Now, they realized that hundreds of Ugandan soldiers would also have to be neutralized. This was no longer just a hijacking. It was a war. The military knew that every second counted. The deadline was just 48 hours away. The Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad, began searching for information. How many terrorists were inside? Where were the hostages being held? Were there weaknesses in Uganda's defenses? One officer had a surprising connection to Entebbe. Colonel Muki Betzer, a senior Israeli commando, had trained Ugandan paratroopers years earlier. He knew the layout of the airport and the surrounding area. But there was one problem. That was 6 years ago, Betzer admitted. I have no idea what's changed. They needed updated intelligence. But how? A secret spy mission over Entebbe. The answer came from an unexpected source, a pilot who worked for Mossad, Israel's secret service. He was stationed in Nairobi, Kenya, and had clearance to fly private aircraft over Uganda. When asked if he could help, he didn't hesitate. I'll get you what you need. Flying a small private plane, he filed an innocent-sounding flight plan, a scenic tour over Lake Victoria. But instead of sightseeing, he flew directly over Entebbe Airport, taking photographs of the terminal, runways, and military installations. The photos confirmed their worst fears. The old terminal building was heavily guarded. 10 terrorists were inside, not just 4. 80 to 120 Ugandan soldiers were stationed around the area. The hostages were surrounded on all sides. The mission was now far more dangerous than expected. With time running out, Israeli commanders had to make a decision. A rescue mission was possible, but it would require 1. A surprise landing in Entebbe. 2. A ground assault on both the terrorists and Ugandan troops. 3. Extracting over 100 hostages alive. 4. Flying back to Israel before reinforcements arrived. It was an insane plan. The smallest mistake would mean disaster. The clock was ticking. Would Israel risk everything to save its people? The Entebbe crisis was growing more dire by the hour. The terrorists had armed explosives inside the terminal. The deadline was 48 hours away. If Israel did not meet their demands, the executions would begin. Many in the government feared that an attack was too dangerous. Entebbe was 4,000 kilometers, 2,500 miles, away, deep in hostile territory. No nation had ever attempted a military rescue operation on such a scale. After hours of debate, the government authorized a top-secret military operation. Its goal? Storm Entebbe, kill the terrorists, and bring the hostages home, alive. But how could they possibly do it? The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, quickly began designing what would become one of the most daring military operations in history. The challenges were overwhelming. 1. How to reach Uganda undetected. 2. How to land safely at Entebbe Airport. 3. How to attack without triggering a massacre. 4. How to escape before Ugandan reinforcements arrived. One thing was clear, this had to be done with complete surprise. The Israeli Air Force determined that the only aircraft capable of making the journey was the C-130 Hercules transport plane. These planes could carry both soldiers and equipment, but there was one major problem. They would have just enough fuel to get to Uganda, but not enough to return. The only way home was to refuel after the battle. That meant either stealing fuel from Uganda or finding a friendly nation willing to help. A secret diplomatic effort was launched. Kenya, Israel's quiet ally in East Africa, agreed to allow refueling at Nairobi Airport. But if the mission failed, Kenya risked war with Uganda. Everything had to go perfectly. One officer, Colonel Muki Betzer, had trained Ugandan paratroopers in the early 1970s. He remembered a key detail that could help them get close to the terminal without raising suspicion. In Uganda, he explained, soldiers always stop and salute Idi Amin's black Mercedes when it passes. This gave them an idea. Why not disguise the commandos as Ugandan officers? The plan was bold and crazy, but it just might work. 1. The first Hercules would land at Entebbe, carrying a black Mercedes and 2 Land Rovers, just like the ones used by Idi Amin. 2. The commandos would dress as Ugandan officers and drive toward the terminal. 3. The deception would allow them to get close enough to launch a surprise attack. 4. Once the terrorists were neutralized, reinforcements would arrive in 3 more Hercules planes. The entire operation would take only 90 minutes. Any longer and Ugandan forces would surround them. The mission was now officially named Operation Thunderbolt. The next step was choosing who would lead the mission. The answer was clear. Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Yoni Netanyahu, an elite Israeli commando and older brother of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Yoni was a brilliant strategist and a fearless leader. He understood that this operation was nearly impossible, but if there was even a chance to save lives, he was willing to risk everything. "We go in," he told his men. Under him, 4 commando teams were assembled. 1. The assault team, led by Yoni Netanyahu. This group would storm the terminal and kill the terrorists. 2. The perimeter team. Their job was to hold off Ugandan forces and prevent reinforcements from arriving. 3. The extraction team. They would gather the hostages and rush them to the planes. 4. The air support team. Pilots and engineers who would keep the aircraft ready for immediate takeoff. Each soldier was handpicked for skill, discipline, and bravery. To prepare, the team built a life-size replica of the Entebbe terminal inside an Israeli Air Force hangar. For 2 days straight, they practiced the attack over and over again. There was no room for error. If the terrorists heard them coming, they would start executing hostages immediately. Tension was high. Everyone knew this mission had never been attempted before. As they made their final preparations, Yoni Netanyahu gathered his men. His voice was calm, but firm. "This will be dangerous. Some of us may not come back. But if we succeed, we will change history." The men nodded. There was no turning back now. The planes were loaded. The black Mercedes was ready. The soldiers were armed. Operation Thunderbolt had begun. With the plan finalized, 4 Israeli C-130 Hercules aircraft sat on the tarmac at Sharm el-Sheikh, Israel's southernmost airfield. Each plane was packed with elite commandos, military equipment, and armored vehicles. The first Hercules carried the black Mercedes and 2 Land Rovers meant to trick Ugandan soldiers into believing Idi Amin himself had arrived. Every soldier knew what was at stake. If the mission failed, there would be no reinforcements, no rescue, no way home. They would either bring the hostages back or die trying. On the afternoon of July 3, 1976, just hours before the terrorists' execution deadline, the order was given, launch. One by one, the massive Hercules aircraft began rolling down the runway. But there was an immediate problem. The planes were overloaded. Each aircraft was carrying extra fuel, weapons, and over 100 troops. The hot desert air made it even harder to lift off. As the first plane approached the end of the runway, the pilot, Joshua Shunny, gritted his teeth. He knew that if the plane didn't gain enough speed, it would plunge into the sea. "Come on, come on!" The aircraft was just meters away from disaster when it finally lifted off, skimming just above the water. The 3 remaining planes followed, each struggling to take flight under the extreme weight. They had made it into the air, but the most dangerous part was still ahead. The flight to Entebbe would take 8 hours, but they had to remain completely undetected. That meant flying at an extremely low altitude, just 30 feet, 10 meters, above the Red Sea, to avoid radar from Egypt, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia. Flying this low was deadly. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they would crash into the water. The commandos sat silently, their weapons strapped to their bodies. Some stared at the floor, lost in thought. Others clutched good luck charms. Many knew they might not survive the night. Hours passed in eerie silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the engines. The pilots knew they couldn't let their guard down, not even for a second. Then, just as they approached the Eritrean coastline, the radio crackled. Enemy radar detected. The entire mission was now in jeopardy. The moment of truth. Israeli intelligence had identified a gap in enemy radar coverage over Eritrea, where they could gain altitude without being detected. But they had to time it perfectly. At exactly 3 a.m., the lead plane pulled up sharply, climbing to 20,000 feet. The others followed in perfect sequence. The pilots held their breath. Would the enemy spot them? Seconds passed. Then a minute. Nothing. They had made it. But now, they were approaching Uganda. The real battle was about to begin. 20 minutes to go, and inside the planes, the soldiers prepared for battle. Yoni Netanyahu turned to his men. "From the moment we land, we have 7 minutes to reach the terminal. No mistakes. No hesitation. This has to be perfect." The commandos checked their weapons one last time. Their hearts pounded as they braced for what was ahead. The hostages were waiting. The terrorists were waiting. And so was Idi Amin's army. The first Hercules plane touched down at Entebbe Airport at exactly 11 p.m. on July 3, 1976. The massive aircraft rumbled across the tarmac, slowing to a stop just past the old terminal. The Israeli commandos inside took a deep breath. The most dangerous part was about to begin. As the rear cargo doors opened, the carefully prepared deception began. The black Mercedes, meant to resemble Idi Amin's personal vehicle, rolled out, flanked by two Land Rovers carrying Israeli commandos dressed in Ugandan military uniforms. The plan was simple but dangerous. Trick the Ugandan guards into thinking this was an official convoy, drive up to the terminal, and launch a surprise attack. For a few moments, everything went smoothly. Then, a Ugandan soldier stepped forward, raising his rifle. The soldier hesitated, confused. The Mercedes looked like Idi Amin's, but something felt wrong. He shouted something in Uganda, the local language. The Israelis knew they had only seconds before their cover was blown. Yoni Netanyahu, leading the convoy, made the call. "Take him out." A sniper fired instantly, dropping the guard before he could sound the alarm. The element of surprise was lost, but the commandos had no time to hesitate. The vehicles accelerated toward the terminal. The assault had begun. As soon as they reached the old terminal, the Israeli commandos leapt from their vehicles and stormed the building. Inside, the hostages were terrified. Some had been sleeping, while others were huddled together, whispering prayers. Then, gunfire erupted outside. The terrorists inside panicked. One of them, realizing the rescue mission was underway, raised his weapon to fire at the hostages. He never got the chance. Israeli commandos burst into the terminal, taking down 3 terrorists in a matter of seconds. "Stay down. We are here to rescue you," one soldier shouted in Hebrew. A split-second gunfight erupted. Bullets flew across the terminal. Glass shattered. One hostage, Jean-Jacques Mimouni, was tragically killed in the crossfire. Another was wounded. In less than 2 minutes, all the terrorists were dead. Just as the commandos thought they had secured the terminal, machine gun fire erupted from outside. The Ugandan military had realized what was happening, and they were not going to let the Israelis leave without a fight. From a watchtower, Ugandan snipers opened fire. Commandos scrambled for cover, returning shots. Then, disaster struck. A bullet hit Yoni Netanyahu. The mission commander, the man leading the operation, collapsed onto the tarmac, blood spreading across his uniform. The soldiers rushed to his side, but Yoni was mortally wounded. Despite their grief, the commandos had no time to mourn. The hostages had to be evacuated immediately, or the entire mission would collapse. With Ugandan soldiers still firing, the Israeli commandos began rushing the hostages out of the terminal. Many were barefoot, confused, and too weak to run. Soldiers carried the injured, yelling at everyone else to move as fast as they could. The first group of hostages sprinted toward the Hercules, bullets whizzing past them. One Israeli soldier, seeing that the Ugandan Air Force had several MiG fighter jets parked nearby, made a split-second decision. Destroy the planes. Explosives were planted on the Ugandan MiG-21 fighter jets, ensuring that there would be no pursuit. The airfield shook with explosions. As they were about to leave, they found out that one elderly hostage, Dora Bloch, was missing. She had been taken to a Ugandan hospital earlier in the day. There was no way to rescue her now. With all remaining hostages accounted for, the commandos raced back to their planes. The final order came through. "We're leaving. Now." Engines roared to life. The Hercules transport planes began taxiing down the runway, lifting into the sky just as Ugandan reinforcements arrived. They had done it. The mission was complete. But for Yoni Netanyahu, Israel's hero, it was his final battle. One by one, the remaining Israeli aircraft took off, leaving behind a burning airfield, scattered bodies, and a dictator humiliated in his own country. For the Israeli soldiers, the moment should have been victorious. They had just pulled off the most daring hostage rescue in modern history. But their joy was overshadowed by a heartbreaking loss. Lieutenant Colonel Yoni Netanyahu, the mission commander, had been shot by a Ugandan sniper during the firefight. He was still alive, but barely. Medics rushed to save him, applying pressure to the wound, giving him oxygen, but deep down, they knew. Yoni was fading fast. A soldier held his hand. "We're almost home, Yoni. Hold on." But minutes before landing in Kenya, Yoni Netanyahu died. The man who had led the impossible mission, the mission that no one believed could succeed, never made it home. The operation wasn't over yet. The Hercules planes had barely enough fuel to escape Uganda, but not enough to get back to Israel. The team's only hope was Kenya, a country that had secretly agreed to let Israel refuel at Nairobi airport. But there was a problem. The Kenyan government was terrified of retaliation from Uganda. Idi Amin had powerful African allies, and if they found out Kenya had helped Israel, it could mean war. The Israeli Air Force had sent a backup team to Nairobi, led by future Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, to secure the refueling. But when the planes arrived, the situation was tense. Would Kenya keep its promise? Or would they betray Israel to save themselves? At first, the Kenyan officials hesitated. Then, at the last moment, approval came through. The Israelis had just enough time to refuel before taking off again. With refueling complete, the Israeli planes finally turned north, heading home. The soldiers and hostages sat in silence, exhausted beyond words. Some wept for Yoni Netanyahu. Others stared blankly at the floor, unable to believe what had just happened. Then, a crackling sound from the radio. "You are entering Israeli airspace. Welcome home." The tension broke. Tears turned to cheers. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had rescued 102 hostages from 4,000 kilometers away, fighting an enemy army and defying the world's expectations. The moment the first aircraft touched down at Ben Gurion Airport, an explosion of cheers, tears, and celebrations erupted. Families rushed forward, embracing their loved ones. The entire nation of Israel was glued to their radios, listening in disbelief. The hostages, men, women, and children, stepped off the planes, some still in shock, others crying with joy. Many had believed they would never see their families again. They had already prepared to die in Entebbe. One woman, cradling her child, whispered to a soldier, "You have given me back my life." But for the Netanyahu family, there was no celebration. As the flag-draped coffin of Yoni Netanyahu was carried off the plane, his fellow soldiers stood at attention. There was no cheering, only silence. Yoni had been the only Israeli soldier killed in action during the rescue. His father, Benzion Netanyahu, a historian who had survived the horrors of the 20th century, stood waiting. When he saw the coffin, he did not weep. His son had just become a legend. News of the Entebbe raid spread across the world within hours. The world was stunned. The idea that a small country like Israel could send soldiers across an entire continent, defeat an enemy army, and rescue over 100 hostages was unbelievable. Newspapers called it the miracle at Entebbe. The United States, Britain, and most Western countries praised Israel's boldness and precision. They had shown that terrorists could be defeated, that hijackings didn't have to end in surrender. But not everyone was pleased. In Uganda, the humiliation was unbearable. Idi Amin, a man who prided himself on being seen as a powerful leader, had been made a fool of on the world stage. His own airport had been attacked, his army had been outmaneuvered, and his prized MiG-21 fighter jets had been destroyed. Furious, he ordered revenge. His first victim was Dora Bloch, the elderly hostage who had been hospitalized in Uganda before the raid. Amin's secret police dragged her from her hospital bed and executed her. But his wrath didn't stop there. In the days after the rescue, Idi Amin carried out brutal revenge killings against his own people. Dozens of Kenyans living in Uganda were murdered, his way of punishing Kenya for allowing the Israeli planes to refuel. His paranoia deepened. He no longer trusted his own officers, ordering purges of anyone suspected of betrayal. By the time his regime collapsed in 1979, over 300,000 Ugandans had been killed under his rule. Back in Israel, Operation Thunderbolt became more than just a rescue mission. It became a message to the world. It told terrorists, "If you take Israelis hostage, we will find you. We will stop you. And we will bring our people home." The success of Entebbe deterred hijackings for years. Even terrorist organizations realized that Israeli forces were willing to strike anywhere, at any time, to protect their people. In honor of the fallen commander, the mission was renamed Operation Yonatan. Decades later, Entebbe is still studied in military academies around the world. Years later, when Benjamin Netanyahu became Prime Minister of Israel, he often spoke of his brother's legacy. Yoni's death was a great tragedy for my family, he said, but his life, and what he fought for, became an inspiration for an entire nation. Tell us what you learnt from this video in the comments.